Welcome to today's Community Cast. My name is Matt Morgan. I'm the pastor at Community Brookside, a new church plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are so blessed by your presence, and we hope that today's content will bring you joy. I'm going to invite you guys, if you have your Bibles, to open up to the book of Mark. We're going to continue on hearing the stories of Jesus with a story that I'm sure many of us have already heard. But again, what I've loved about this summer is us being able to hear these stories again from a little different perspective, getting our eyes deeper into the story to know the context around them so that we can have God revealed to us every week. So in the book of Mark, chapter 11, we're going to read 15 through 19. It's relatively short this morning. But the Word of God, even in its shortness, is incredibly powerful. So hear now the word of the Lord for us today. Verse 15 says, "On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.' The chief priests and teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city." Short one today. But today we step into a moment where Jesus does something pretty bold and rebellious, disruptive, and I gotta be honest, it was probably stupid uncomfortable for everybody who was in the temple, right? You might not have recognized it, but when we read about this moment where Jesus walks into the center of religious life and confronts a system, he's confronting a system that had lost its soul, right? This is not gentle Jesus. It's not quiet little baby Jesus who we like to think is just love your neighbor and speaks with this kind of soft voice. Jesus is not the let's get along Jesus anymore. Jesus gets serious. He's pretty ticked off, if we're honest. In the Gospel of John, the Gospel writer goes on, right? So this was the Gospel of Mark. In John, it's even more kind of poignant. When Jesus takes cords and turns them into whips and starts whoosh, getting people out of the temple. He's driving them out with cords. Jesus is not playing around. But I want to bring us back to last week real quick. So last week we talked about Jesus defying the systems that were put in place that kept a demon-possessed man demon-possessed, right? He was alone. He lived among the tombs. He would have been, by all Jewish understanding, unclean. There was no way that any rabbi was going to go over there and hang out with him. But Jesus says, you know what, forget the systems. I'm going to go and I'm going to heal this man. When it came to Jesus healing this man who was possessed, he ignored all the rules that would have made him himself unclean for showing up to a person who was in need. Jesus did what had to be done to save somebody that everybody else rejected, forgot about, and left chained amongst the dead, right? What's a bit different this morning is that this week we find Jesus not just bucking the system, but Jesus actually works to overturn what had become a terrible temple system. He destroys the systems that kept people from being able to worship. So last week, he ignores tradition. This week, he starts dismantling oppressive systems in the temple. Money changing, overpriced costs for temple sacrifices, corrupt and controlled temple treasury, all of these things made it more difficult for Jewish worshipers to participate in worship. Now, this is especially true for people who were underprivileged, right? The poor, the marginalized, they would have had no way to be able to purchase the sacrifices needed within the temple structure to participate fully in worship. Now, listen, there is nothing here in worship that requires you to come and pay a temple tribute or buy a sacrifice before you come into worship today. We want people to buy into the ministry of the gospel, and we want people to tithe and give to the church to keep our lights on, and Erica paid, and she needs a lot. We need those things to happen, but in ancient temple worship, if you didn't have a sacrifice, you couldn't participate. You couldn't. All people were considered sinners, and there was a structure that said you have to come and offer a sacrifice in order to just walk in the front door, to pray, to participate, to chant, to be a part of the community in worship. Mark tells us that Jesus enters the temple courts and he sees what's happening and begins to just wreck the place, right? He's driving out the merchants and he begins to shut down what was the church. It's no longer a church, it's the marketplace. Jesus is shutting down the marketplace. But the reality is, in this gospel story, it's not just about ancient corruption. It's also about the way that the religious, economic, and cultural systems can still, in this time, keep people chained if we aren't willing to recognize and work to dismantle those things. I've seen some weird internet videos. You guys ever seen those videos? One comes to my mind about the guy who's like, lock them doors. Lock them doors, everybody. We need $50,000 or whatever it is. Lock them doors until we get it. What? I saw another video about a man who's a pastor, and a woman is coming up and she's, pronouncing to the church that she's participating in this deal. She brings an offering to the church in an envelope and says, with my seed money of whatever it is. And he's like, no, wait. That's not what I asked you for. I asked you for 1,000 and this is 500. That's not like the pastor is correcting her. Guys, we have set up weird systems in churches that Jesus would start flipping some tables today. But to understand this moment that we find ourselves in the temple, friends, was a center of worship. It wasn't like they had a ton of churches and people could just go wherever they wanted to worship. The temple was the focus of Jewish worship. This was a place where heaven met earth, right? They believed that God revealed God's self inside the Holy of Holies there in the temple. It was a very special place for the Jewish people. But by Jesus' day, it had become a place where the poor were being exploited because the prices of the temple sacrifices were inflated, sometimes making sacrifices for them unachievable. The temple was also a place where travelers and pilgrims from all over the Roman Empire, if you were Jewish and you lived in, somebody name a Roman town, not Italy, but something like, if you were in Susa or in Caesarea Philippi, any of those places, you as a Jewish worshiper were required to make a pilgrimage to the temple to maintain your connection to the temple system. And when you get there from whatever area of the world you lived in, you were expected to change your money from the Roman denarius system into what was called a Tyrian silver system. So you transferred money to the temple. You exchange it for silver coins so that you may go and pay the temple workers, the money changers, so that you could buy a sacrifice. And of course, have you ever been out of the country and you go to exchange your money? Some of you, yes. Some of you, no. If you've ever gone to those either coin change machines or the people who are sitting at a kiosk counting out dollars, the exchange rate was stupid, right? You always get the short end of the stick when it comes to exchanging money. And the same was true in the temple of the Lord in the first century. The temple in Jesus' time became a place where priests profited, but especially the high priest and his family. You might recognize the name Caiaphas, right? The name Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest during Jesus' life, and his father's name was Annas. And so in the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, Jesus first has to show up to Annas' home, and Annas says, oh yeah, you are a blasphemer, go and see my son Caiaphas. So then Jesus goes to Caiaphas' house. Caiaphas, says, all right, we're going to have to murder you, but they have to bring him to the Romans. It's this whole process of my dad has power, Annas has power, and then Caiaphas, his son, has power, and they want to maintain that control over the temple because for them, it's a money-making scheme. Does that at all sound like the church in America in 2026? Right? Friends, I have no plans when I die to pass this church down to my children, okay? That is not what I think is important. I don't necessarily believe in this, the line of prophecy from me to my children. I don't think that's a thing. Yeah, this ancestral church. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's really great that we are connected to our Catholic brothers and sisters who talk about how the Pope came from whoever all the way back to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. Like, I get that. That's cool. I don't know that our churches should look like that, right? So Annas is still instrumental in what went on in the Sanhedrin. This is the group of people who judged all of Israel. He set up the systems that enriched himself and then enriched his son-in-law before the temple was destroyed in the year 70. And because of these religious leaders, these high priests, their loyalty to Rome, their leadership was influenced by Gentile worship, right? Gentile worship was all about Caesar. Caesar was a god, right? This meant that worship in the temple began to become more watered down in order that the temple worship began to look more like Roman worship. But the saddest part of the temple system of Jesus' time was that prayer was drowned out by commerce. In other words, the system was incredibly broken. It was unjust. It was keeping people chained instead of allowing them to be set free from their sins. Are there places where you see injustice hiding in religious systems today? I think that we can all say yes to that. So I want you guys to imagine yourself as Jesus walking into the temple courts. So you walk into the temple courts. What do you see? What do you visualize when you think about buying and selling in the temple courts? What do you see? What? Animals, for sure. What else? Jewelry? Yeah, sure. Well, I think that was... Sorry, hit the ceiling. Got to warm up a little bit here. What? Silver? Yes, absolutely. Does anybody remember what kind of silver? What did I call it? Nope. Nope. Sorry, I heard margarita. That is not... It was called Tyrian. Tyrian silver. Yes, thank you. What else do you think was happening in the temple at the time? Probably food, absolutely. It became a big marketplace, right? Does anybody see any of that happening in churches now when you walk in the front door and you can buy the pastor's latest book in their coffee shop, where you can also buy paintings that were made in China and are all AI, right? That's a thing in the church today. You know what we don't have in this church? Well, first of all, a lot of things. We don't have a functional elevator half the time. But I mean, friends, I love our country. Can I get an amen? Do you see an American flag in here? Do we come in this place to worship the American Empire or Jesus Christ? Right? You don't see a pride flag in here either. You know why? The only agenda in this church is Jesus, right? We don't have to clap for that, but we can. Listen, I want us to be a church that looks like the Jesus of the Gospels, a radical church that walks out every Sunday and breaks down the walls that keep people separated from God. I don't want anything to steal our focus from that. I've been in so much trouble from people like, where's your cross in your worship space? Where's your cross and flame? Are you really Methodist? Do you really believe in the mission of the Methodist Church? Yes, otherwise I wouldn't be up here. I wouldn't be doing this. We have got to stop making church about agendas, and we've got to start making church about Jesus again, right? Not about the bookstores, not about the prophets, not about all that. Now, don't get me wrong. When we get ready to build a building, we're going to be on this beautiful in-between where we are doing the mission of our church in a building that is partially funded by people who rent space from us, right? That's, I think, a very different story than trying to sell things that enrich the church. We want to offset the cost of doing ministry so that the dollars that come into this place go out of this place to serve the world. Amen. I'm tired of churches spending $10,000 per stained glass window and keeping people hungry. That's not us. Okay, I'm going to get back to my script here. All right. So in the temple courts, we see exploitation of the poor. We see manipulation of prices. We see market fixing. We see greed. We see noise. There are barriers everywhere for the poor that they can't be one of us. They're not good enough. They can't afford to be the kind of worshipers we are. I don't care if you get... listen. I don't care if you give $1 to this church or nothing to this church or give half of your money to this church. It doesn't make you any better Christian than anybody else. I've had people who throw it in my face before they've left our church saying things like, well, if you don't do this, then I don't know that I can be a part of your church anymore. Bye. This church is not my church. This is the church of Jesus. And Jesus doesn't want your money if it comes with an agenda. He doesn't. Sorry. Back to my... We are seeing people in the first century temple being pushed away from God by the people who are supposed to be calling them closer. Friends, this is not just a picture of the ancient church. This is a picture of us today. I don't want the Church of Jesus Christ to look like political noise or monetary agendas or selling the latest thing so that we can enrich ourselves. You guys know how much money I make? Oh, it's so much. You shouldn't care, right? Mark does. He does. He's our treasurer. I could be a really successful car salesman. I love cars. I could do that really well and make a ton of money. I'm not passionate about cars like I'm passionate about Jesus. And I would do it for way less money to make sure that people know who Jesus is. I'm tired of people, first of all, when people see my house, they're like, oh my God, how much money are you making? No, that's my wife. She's very important. But like, I want to make sure that you guys understand that nothing we do in here is about me or enriching me or setting up my son to be the next pastor of our church, because that's stupid. It's not a knock against you, son. I think you could do it. Yeah, I am. You know what I should do? I'll just get back to this. All right. So Jesus sees all these crazy things happening in the temple of Jesus. Sorry, not the temple of Jesus, the temple of God at the time. And he can't stay silent anymore. And friends, we have been too silent for too long. And now the church thinks that bookstores and coffee shops are the normal mode of the church. I understand trying to offset costs, but man, when you're making money hand over fist, when you're opening your 19th campus, maybe we need to be putting more money into the ministry that the church does rather than the facilities that the church owns. So Jesus starts throwing over tables. He drives out the merchants. He shuts down the marketplace inside the church. He stops the flow of profit. And who gets really mad? The people who are making the money. The religious leaders, it says, seek a way to kill Jesus. You have really messed up when you got the rich people after you. Jesus is ticked off in this moment and stops at nothing to show the church what's important. And I want to be clear, this isn't Jesus losing his temper. This is Jesus restoring the purpose of worship. This is called righteous anger, right? This is one of those things that we struggle with. Now, if Jesus isn't a sinner, why would he make whips out of cords? Well, because Jesus is pretty upset, right? That doesn't mean we should do that. That doesn't give us permission to start driving people out of churches with cords. But Jesus tells us in this moment how zealous he is for his Father's house. And that is fulfilling prophecy. Was Jesus mad? Yes. But he didn't get angry in that moment and smite everybody dead, right? He gets mad at everybody who is taking advantage of the system. He gets mad, and then he quotes the prophet Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is reading, Isaiah was a prophet in the ancient times, and this was like 700 years before Jesus. And here's what Isaiah says in chapter 56, verse 6 and 7. Levi, this is going to be on the screen. In verse 6, it says, and foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and all who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for who? All nations. This is the prophet Isaiah speaking 700 years before Jesus. And you know who the temple became for? The people who could afford it. It was no longer a house of prayer for all nations. It wasn't what God had said to Isaiah was going to be the purpose of the temple. It was, this is for me and my family, and we will enrich ourselves. Here in the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah quoted God. These are God's words. God says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." Not the wealthy, not just the insiders, not just for those who can afford to make the sacrifice, not just for the Jews who think they are God's chosen people. It's not just for anybody, it is for all nations. That is the only reason that we are also included. We, friends, are all nations. In case you didn't remember this, Jesus was not an American white guy, all right? We have this beautiful example over the last couple of weeks where Jesus starts by defying tradition in ways that risk his ceremonial cleanliness so that he can go and heal a man who's possessed by demons. And now we see Jesus this week actively working to break down the systems that were put in place to maintain wealth and power in the places where wealth and power shouldn't matter. Right? Jesus tells us, don't go sit at the head of the table. There might be somebody more important than you. Instead, be humble. Sit at the lowest and the least inviting place in the table. And if you are the important person, they'll move you. They'll put you in the place that you want to be. Don't just assume that you're the coolest cat in the room. You can't be. Not with Doug here. He's the coolest one in the room, always. So the question we need to ask ourselves this week is, where is Jesus calling each of us to confront corruption or injustice now? Where are the places in our world where we need to be as bold as Jesus to bring justice, to right the wrongs that have been perpetrated against those who are marginalized? And if we don't see those places, we're not looking. The reality is that the temple marketplace wasn't just inconvenient for people who wanted to make a sacrifice. It wasn't like, oh gosh, now I got to count out my little denarius and trade it in for the Tyrian silver. It's not just about, well, do I purchase 2 doves because I've done this thing and can't afford the goat I'm supposed to offer? It wasn't just an inconvenience because of that. It was oppressive. It was actively oppressing people. It blocked Gentiles from worship completely, which was nothing new, right? Jewish people were the only people allowed inside the temple inner building, right? Gentiles were allowed to be out in the outer courts, but that's it. They couldn't come in to worship. Exclusion from the beginning, right? And it wasn't just that. People who were poor and couldn't afford the sacrifices that they needed to make, they couldn't participate either. The temple marketplace exploited the poor, which again was normal for these people. They had been raised in this kind of understanding that, well, I guess I just can't worship this week because I don't have enough money to buy the replacement sacrifice. For generations, those who had religious authority exploited the poor for their own gain. The poor couldn't afford to offer sacrifices. And in the book of Exodus, we have this beginning of the temple structure and system where God prescribes what kind of sacrifices need to be made in what kind of moment. So in Exodus, we have that beginning, and then in Deuteronomy, we have it even deeper explained, and in Leviticus, we find out more and more about the intricacies of what God's temple system needs to look like, and whether it's a cattle that needs to be butchered and sacrificed, or a goat, or a lamb, or a spotless lamb, or a dove, or 2 doves. God begins to lay that all out in the Old Testament. Doves can be purchased and offered in exchange for the more expensive cattle offerings for those who couldn't afford it. That's why the dove changers were specifically mentioned here in this story. When Jesus is turning over the tables of the money changers, he also turns over the benches of those who were selling doves. This was the offering that was supposed to be affordable for the poor, that allowed them to participate in their cultural worship. But in this time, they were being influenced and inflated in a way that made even the cheaper offerings inaccessible and unobtainable for the poor. The temple marketplace drowned out prayer by turning worship into profit. Jesus chose to overturn the tables in the temple because I strongly believe that he wants to overturn any barriers between God and God's people. And this is the same mentality that I think that we need to have in our time. We need to recognize and remove anything that might become a barrier for those who are afraid to walk into the front doors of a church. The first Sunday, I worked at a church, and it was pretty intimidating the first Sunday I walked in the front door. Now, I had been there at my office. I had been able to set up everything. But that first Sunday morning, the giant wooden doors of this beautiful sanctuary were closed. Do you know how hard it is for somebody who's not being paid to walk in a door that's closed with a tiny little window, almost like what's the password, right? And I had to open the door for myself, which is not a big deal because I was being paid to be there. If I wanted to go to church on Sunday morning and the door was closed and there was no invitational person standing outside on the front porch like, Price does and Chuck does, if there was nobody, I would turn around and go somewhere else. In this story, Jesus is restoring access. He's restoring dignity to those who had lost their ability to afford the proper and appropriate sacrifices. He's bringing justice into this terrible situation. And by flipping over tables, Jesus is declaring everyone gets to come close to God. It's not just for the Jews. It's not just for the rich. Everyone can be here. Jesus doesn't cleanse the temple just to make a point. He cleanses the temple to make it holy again. Because Jesus does this in the temple of God, we can be sure that he would do the same exact thing to many of our churches today if he showed up. Jesus wants our church and every other church to be a place of prayer, to be a place of welcome, of justice, of healing, a place where the vulnerable are protected rather than exploited, a place where the poor are honored, a place where outsiders who don't look like us are welcomed and embraced, a place where God's presence is accessible. And I've mentioned it before, but oftentimes churches in America don't quite live up to that image. Friends, the church is not a business. It's not a marketplace. The church isn't a club where we have to have our membership stamp to come back in. And most of all, the church is not a performance. Worship up here shouldn't be a performance. Worship out here shouldn't be. What I'm doing shouldn't be a performance. This is revealing who God is, right? Like talking through scriptures and praising God. It should never be a performance. But our church and every other church is called to be a house of prayer for all nations. So if we know what kind of church that Jesus is calling us to be, are we answering that call to be that church today? Would Jesus be disappointed in the church that we are becoming? Would Jesus show up to Community Brookside and flip over? Well, we don't have tables per se, but would Jesus start flipping stuff over if he walked in our front door? Are there areas, if Jesus showed up in your life, that Jesus would start flipping tables? Your personal life, your dating life, your marital relationship life, your work life? Because I don't think Jesus wants to stop at just the places that we are intentionally making holy. I think Jesus wants to make every area of our life holy. And if there's anything that's blocking us from God, Jesus would flip that over too. Where is Jesus inviting us to overturn tables in our world right now? Is it at work or school? Is it in our political systems or here in this building? None of us are perfect. This church is not perfect. We're going to make mistakes. Wherever we find injustice, Jesus has made it clear that we have to move to fight against it. That we have to take up the same kind of role that Jesus does, an active role that says, no longer will I let people who've been kept outside be outside. We have to be Jesus in our world now. So here's what I want you to take with you today as we close. Jesus overturned the tables that block people from God, and in doing so calls us to participate in that same kind of active move. Jesus was fearless in confronting the corruption that was a part of his church at the time. Jesus restores access. He protects the vulnerable. He calls the church to be a church of justice. He demands prayer. He disrupts systems that keep people chained, and he restores worship to what God created it to be. And that Jesus of the Gospels invites us to do that today. Not just to change lives, but to change systems, not just to help individual people, but to confront injustice wherever we find it. Again, that's part of our baptism affirmation, that we will seek it out and abolish it. He doesn't just call that for us to be those kind of people in our praying, but he wants us as a church, a community, to become a house of prayer for all nations. Let that be us. I pray that for our church and for us as individuals. Let's pray together.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's Community Cast. We hope that you were blessed by today's conversation. If you'd like to know more about Community Brookside, please feel free to visit us at our website, communitybrookside.com, or find us on your favorite social media outlet. We hope to hear from you soon. Be blessed.